Doctors and nurses have read it. What was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? Cardiac IQ. Had a gentleman who was DNR on comfort care. He was demented and was cursing like a sailor. He seemed to have moments of clarity and would ask to see his brothers who were both passed. After a particularly worrisome heart rhythm, he went back into a sinus tachycardia and looked me in my eyes and said, "Hey, what's your name? Cabk. What do you do here?" "I'm a nurse." After this, he was quiet for some time. Then he said, "Duck you." And then he died about 20 minutes later. I can only imagine what was going through his mind as he passed. Nailed it. But I don't know how to get there. Grandpa in hospice. Hadn't spoken in days. Died about 2 hours later. Yup, that's creepy as all duck. On the plus side, it looks like he figured it out. I work in a cardiac IQ. We had a patient who had a pulmonary artery rupture, a rare but known complication of a Swan-Ganz catheter. One minute he was joking around with us, and the next bright red blood was spewing out of his mouth. His last words before he died were, "Why is this happening to me?" It still haunts me years later. Edit. Whoa, this is my highest rated comment. I cried again tonight for this man. Hug your loved ones. I can't imagine how awful that was. Get home safe, little one. It wasn't what he said. He said the same thing to me anytime I had him as a patient for the evening. It was how he said it. He gave me this look and paused like he knew. The DNRs, in my experience, always know when it's time. It's creepy. Relieved. They're relieved when it comes. Most of my patients were older and usually happy that they might see their friends and family again. Relieved that the pain will be gone and that they won't be lonely ever again. Speaking of, if you have older relatives that aren't assholes, please visit them. They miss you. I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia/Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. We would have long chats and joke around with each other, but in the last 2 weeks of his life, he stopped talking completely and didn't really acknowledge conversation directed at him at all. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. I told him I was leaving for the night and that I'd see him the following day, and he looked me in the eyes and smiled so genuinely and said, "You look like an angel." I thought it was so sweet because he had not seemed lucid in weeks. He died the next morning. It really messed with me. My grandfather on his deathbed said they have no eyes. Still give me chills. You're not gonna believe this. Talk about a cliffhanger. Can't wait for season 2 of Old Man with Heart Failure. Not a doctor, but I overheard an old lady whisper this to her old husband dying of kidney problems. "You are going to beat this. You got away with murder. This is nothing." Nurse here had a patient come into the ER with shortness of breath. He started deteriorating in the ER and then quite rapidly on the transport up the IQ. We got him wheeled into his room, replaced the air lines and tubes with our own, and transferred him from the transport stretcher to his IQ bed. He actually did most of the transfer himself. He didn't say anything, but just before he died he pleasantly adjusted his own pillow, laid his head down, and then his eyes went blank. This man just made himself comfortable before laying down to die. He had to fluff his own pillows? Damn. I found one of my comfort measures only patient standing at the side of his bed. It surprised me because he had been mostly unresponsive during my shift. I helped him back into bed and he asked me why all these people were in his room. He suddenly became quiet again and I noticed he wasn't breathing. He was a DNR, so there wasn't anything to do to try to bring him back. Looking back, he may have been talking about me and the CNA that was helping me get him back into bed, but who knows what or who he was seeing the last minutes of his life. Still creeps me out a little when I think about it. I had a cousin that had cancer and died when he was a little kid. He once asked her mother why all these people visited and she said, "Because your cousins, aunts, and uncles love you very much and want you to get better." And he answered, "I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the ones that visit me at night." I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough. Backstory: Dad had manuscript. He'd had it since he was 18. Diagnosed at 20. Married my mom at 24. Had me at 29. Died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice. He and mom were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mom jokingly said, "You know Tim, the best thing you could do would be to die on a Wednesday. That way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday, so more people could come." The morning we got the call that it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked if that day had any significance. It's not even 6 AM yet, so mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was, and they'd tell him it was the 20th. He'd look irritated but accept it. That morning, he asked what day it was, and they said, "It's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favorite nurse's hand, and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend, and we did just as he and mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To his dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him. Back when I was a CNA, this one resident fell off a bike for exercise in part and seized. They came to and became lucid and said, "I think I'm dying," but everyone in the room assured her that wasn't going to happen. She seized up and was dead within minutes. Did she hit her head? Unconscious, lucid. Death is a common progression of a hematoma. Yes, very hard. DNR patient was on comfort cares. Was on a high dose of morphine and hallucinating. She would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure she was safe. She tried to get up, and I went to ask her what she needed. She grabbed my arm and pulled me down towards her face and said, very angrily, "Kill me." That one ducked with me for a while. I was in the hospital for a week on morphine. After a while that stuff really starts to mess with you. My father told me he was taking enough to kill a horse. This was towards the end. He told me how he'd see my grandma and his brother come down and tell him it's not time yet. They literally read him his favorite prayer, finished it, and then he passed. I hate cancer. Checked in on a patient before the end of my shift, and she was in good spirits, had been joking with me the whole time. Her condition was 10 years new trash, but she had been positive throughout. I asked how she was doing, and she replied by singing "The Old Grey Mare Ain't What She Used to Be" and wished me a good night. I came in the next morning, and she had coded and died overnight. Not a nurse, not a doctor, but I'm an apprentice funeral director. We went to a nursing home on a removal, and as we were walking down the hall, one of the patients got antsy and opened the door to his room and saw us walking with a stretcher. "I'll see you next week, boys." And guess who we had to pick up the next week? See you there. That seems more reassuring than scary in my opinion. Kind of depends what that means. Came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who had been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning, but obs all fine, ECG fine, and so I just asked someone to sit with him to keep an eye on him / reassure him for me. He gets worse, really panicky, heavy breathing. He's on his side in the fetal position. Doctors will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get here, and that he won't face the other way. Ob's still all fine at this point, but he's more agitated, so again I suggest he move position for comfort, and that's when he says, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll die." He repeated this a few times to me. He arrested literally as the doctors walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew. If I turn to face the other way, I'll die. That was my exact same thought the first time I had a panic attack. Not a hospital story, but according to my family, my great grandfather was unresponsive his final few days, but suddenly sat bolt upright in the bed and then had a huge smile and raised his hands out as if greeting someone. Then he fell back and died. Wow. My dad went the same way an hour or so before he passed. He was DNR. Not a doctor or nurse, but my grandfather was on hospice care at home, and for 2 days he told us that he had to go with the little red-haired girl. We didn't know what he was talking about. When he died, we cleaned him up and called the hospice nurse on duty, who came right over. I happened to be the one to answer the door, and there she stood. 5'2" or so, with gorgeous blue eyes and the most beautiful red hair you've ever seen. I couldn't even manage hello, but my grandmother looked around me and said very cheerfully, "Please come in. He's been waiting for you." Sounds like the opening of some kind of feel-good ghost story. Not a doctor or a nurse, but when I visit a friend at a hospital once, this 70-year-old guy asked an attending nurse if she dried his popsicle one last time in case he doesn't make it. Pretty sure he was there for a broken leg. So, did she? Do you want to hear the answer you want to hear, or do you want to hear the answer you deserve? My first hospice case. She was on morphine and started mock smoking. She looked at me, took my hand, and said please in the most pleading voice I've ever heard. I sat with her body until the coroner arrived. She has no friends or family. Only her lawyer showed up. I've only done one hospice case since. That's so sad. She must have been so lonely. My dad passed away 2 months ago, and the last words he ever said to me were "I love you too." I had this patient who had a stroke. After that he recovered fine, but did get pneumonia like 4 weeks into his recovery. The last words he said to me was at like 4 in the morning. "You took his girl and you will burn in hell for it." I actually took a girlfriend from a friend of mine. Somehow he knew. Didn't you read the rules of the bro code? I actually have 3 that stick out in my mind. An 83-year-old woman that said "My mom's here. Are we going?" She died a few minutes later. Another older lady said "I think I'm going to die today." We took vitals. Everything seemed fine. She was stable. She had a heart attack a couple hours later. Not her last words, but the last she ever said to me. The last one is definitely the creepiest. A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said "The man in black is here." She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said "He's in all black, and he's got a top hat on." Then she whispered, "And his eyes are red," while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind the CNA, like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. My mom was watching over my great grandfather in the hospital. He'd been unresponsive for a day or so, when suddenly he said, "It's about damn time you got here. I've been waiting." And then he died. I'm working on my mother's eulogy for tomorrow's wake. I'm going to go into detail for anyone that is smoking, because I think it's something you should reconsider. My mom was diagnosed with terminal lung and pancreatic cancer. Mass had developed around her vocal cords and made it hard for her to speak. She smoked all of her life, and it finally caught up with her. It attacked her quick. From time she was diagnosed to time she passed away, it was less than 2 weeks. First she lost her voice, then she had difficulty breathing, became weak, she couldn't walk too far, then she could only walk a little, then nothing at all. She had trouble eating. The night she died I let her smoke her cigarette. Doctor said it didn't matter anymore, and my sister and I took mom into her bed, and I knew, as did my sister, it was the last time. We spent a few hours with her, holding her, and I got up, lost it a bit, and my mom said, "Don't be sad," loudly with all her might. I was fortunate to be with my mother at that time. She was due to have hospice that Monday, but she did not make it. Lung cancer kills quickly. I hope none of you have to deal with that. Consider it that next cigarette. It's just a matter of time. Well, enough preaching. Last year, my grandfather started desperately pleading for his life with his German captors from WWII. The doctor present was smart and said in German, You are free hair caricature. You are free. And then he died. That was nice from the doctor. My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. I was trying to check her vitals, and she was super agitated, and had been all day. She managed to bend her fourth pole somehow. She was ripping her gown off, and the sheets off the bed, and she'd yanked her heart monitor off. I was trying to start a blood transfusion, but needed to get her vitals beforehand, which was impossible, because she wouldn't stay still long enough for any of it to read. I'd given her a sedative for what we thought was anxiety, and I was praying it would kick in soon. She kept grabbing my arm saying, "Come here, look at me, help me," with fear in her eyes that I will never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, "I'm trying," which I of course wish was something comforting instead. Then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she shut her mouth, then snapped her eyes wide open, but totally glossed over. She took one last breath as a coworker was helping me while I called the code. Patients with feelings of impending doom are a major red flag that scare the shit out of me. She was going to die and knew it. BTW. Bending her fourth pole. Super impressive. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to my channel for more curated daily Reddit stories.